Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton. You can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. And I'm here with a very special guest, Marlene Bremner. Welcome to the show, Marlene.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Yeah,
really
you're welcome.
To be here.
It is great. I've had a wonderful pleasure reading your first book. It's Hermetic Philosophy and Creative Alchemy, The Emerald Tablet, Corpus Hermeticum, and The Journey Through the Seven Spheres. That's quite a title, but it works really well, actually. And it is all that, actually. And the first thing I just wanted to say is, wow, thank you for such a great book.
Well, my pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine, like, and the other thing I want to say before I forget is like, I really appreciate the breadth of your scholarship. Like, you covered everything. There wasn't much you left out. and you covered it in a way that is thorough, like academically, it's really solid, but you're not an academic. And that's what I love about it. You're an artist. And so it's actually approachable, and it doesn't have that sort of distant, remote academic feel. It's like really tangible and down to earth. And I love that. I love people who can do scholarship, but they're not scholars. And so,
yeah, that was definitely an intention as I was writing it, because I love reading scholarly works, but it's so much better when there's sort of a human connection that you can feel through the writing. And so I really wanted to find that balance of academic scholarly writing, but also have it be accessible.
You nailed it. In fact, you exhort the reader on several occasions to think of approaching the spirits like a lover, like a friend, like a human. And that's the thing about the Greek gods. They're so human,
Mm-hmm.
and they are approachable that way. And so, yeah, I really love that spirit, and it really comes through. So I'm just going to dive in sort of from the beginning. And on page one, I mean, you had me on page one because you start off talking about how, Hermeticism, they're kind of two different things, but kind of the same thing, whatever we want to call it. Hermes, which is more than one thing. All of these things, they are incredibly rich cultural traditions, but you don't hear it mentioned within the major religions of the world, right? You don't. Like, it's just sort of this thing that's sort of off by itself. And it's like, that's so true. And it's kind of tragic and messed up, because really the spirit of Hermetism, I mean, I see it in like a speech that RFK Jr. gave the other night, where he was talking about this, the function of democracy is to liberate the human spirit and allow it to participate in the arts. I mean, that's Hermetics, the liberation of spirit. And so I thought, wow, I mean, that's really something that you started from there. And I'm just going to quote a couple things here. Yet this God of thieves and shepherds is only a partial aspect of the immense and numinous qualities personified by the greatest Hermes. And that's, I mean, again, it's like, that's a message that I've been sending to the astrology community for, gosh, about 10 years now. I mean, when I was ignorant of Hermetics until about halfway through my astrology career. And when I found out, I was like, how did I not know about this? How is this not like common knowledge? And I think you start the book from that place, and I just really appreciate that.
Yeah, I had kind of a similar journey, exploring the occult and astrology and magic and alchemy, and then kind of like, where does this all actually root from? Like,
Nice.
What is where does it go back to? And that brought me into studying Hermeticism proper.
Yeah.
And kind of seeing how that's really the core of all these different esoteric teachings that have come through the Western tradition.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your origin story. You mentioned that you got into polarity therapy at one point. And that sort of was a doorway.
Yeah, like in my late teens, I was really interested in natural healing and alternative forms of healing and energy work. And I moved up to Olympia when I was around 23 or 24 and decided that I wanted to do some proper training with it. And I ended up finding my teacher, who's Dr. Leslie Korn, an amazing polarity therapist and also psychotherapist and nutritionist, just all around very, very
Renaissance person.
skilled woman.
Hmm.
And she became my hands-on teacher for polarity therapy. And then I did some official training programs at a school in Ohio and another school in Colorado. And that was really my first real introduction to Hermetics, though I'm sure, my various studies and interests had like touched on it. But polarity therapy is really based on that conception of there being this one unified field of energy that we're all a part of. And
Wow.
the Hermetic axiom of as above, so below, and the correspondence between the heavenly spheres and the human body and the human energy system. And
Wow.
so with my training, I was learning all about the esoteric anatomy of the body, how the elements work through the body and the different organs that they all relate to, the 7 chakras and the Kundalini, all of that. And
Wow.
then learning how to work with that through hands-on healing.
I get a picture of the polarity therapist as mages, like they're literally just tapping in the same way a mage would if they were creating a talisman or something. Like sounds like pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, and I think, when you're doing a polarity therapy session, when you're holding that space, you do go into sort of a hermetic meditative space of connecting with the source and then opening your own energy to be able to feel and sense what's going on within another person's energy body.
Wow. Intense. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, on further into the book. So yeah, this sort of gospel of Hermes that I've been preaching for about 10 years to the astrology community. It's like it's really great to find another preacher. um let's see. So okay, so one thing that I wanted to ask you about part 1 of the book, we actually get into like there's an intro, and then part 1 we get into some of the, well, almost all of the Hermetic texts you touch on at some point or another, and of course you lead off with the Emerald Tablet, and which is like probably one of the most famous. It's the source of the maxim as above, so below. Of course, it doesn't actually say that.
Right. Not, yeah.
It's a very condensed version of what it says, but I noticed that in the book you chose the oldest version. That's from the alchemist. What is it, Geber? Is that how the Geber?
Yeah, Jabir or Geber.
Geber,
Yeah.
yeah, Jabir, yeah. That's sort of the Latinized version anyways.
Yeah.
It's significantly different from the Latin. Did you notice that?
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
In because in the Latin it says the above corresponds to the below or is like the below. But in this one it says the above is from the below. And I think that's significant to me. It feels significant. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, that's interesting that you noticed that. To me, it says something about the source of creation and where that actually lies, if the above is from the below.
Okay.
And thinking of the below as that which is maybe not yet manifest, or like the prima materia or the unconscious. It's like creation emerging from the darkness. That's what it makes me think of.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, we're going to get to the prima materia. I love that. I love that way you covered that. Moving on into the Corpus Hermeticum. One thing that I have struggled with in reading these texts is like there's sort of and you deal with this later in the book around page 100. In fact, you deal with it explicitly, but I had this question, then I was like, okay, she addresses it on later, but I still kind of want to touch on it because I imagine that other people have the same feeling. There's a certain severity about some of these teachings where it's very ascetic. It's very like, and the body is like bad, and you have to divorce yourself from material reality and embrace the intellect and stuff. And it's like, I mean, yeah. And I get, imagine, especially as a woman, even like that's because you get that message socially. It's not always a healthy message either, and so I was wondering, like, I guess my question is, and I'll just say a little bit about how you deal with it, which I think is brilliant. I mean, in fact, you're talking about polarity here, and you recognize that the Hermetic texts present both a positive and negative view of the body and materiality, and you suggest that these could speak to opposing philosophies within the Hermetic schools. And that was my first thought. My first thought was like, the Greeks were pretty suspicious of eros. If you just look at the story of Helen of Troy and all of this, they were very suspicious of, erotic love. They didn't see it as something they trusted. And so it makes me wonder if like that some of the more negative attitudes towards that are more of the Greek influence, and maybe some of the more positive attitudes, because to me, I don't know, I get the feeling that the Egyptians and Chaldeans or Mesopotamians were a little bit more grounded, a little bit more, they were more agricultural. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, and they did have these kind of very primal sexual warring
Right.
deities, right? Very empowered female deities like
Yes.
Ishtar, Inanna, and Sekhmet.
Yeah, especially Sekhmet. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's that. And I do see what you're saying about the Greeks being a little more conservative in that
In their
regard.
heads, and yeah.
Yeah, and so it could be that maybe that represents a cultural difference in those different writings.
Mm-hmm.
But I also suspect that they're just necessary ways of looking at the body at different points in someone's spiritual
Yeah.
evolution.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it is really important to be able to separate from our lower nature, our instinctual nature, and to go up into the higher realms, to sublimate, go up into the higher realms and get that cool clarity of the intellect and of that higher consciousness.
Yeah, to fasting, for instance, where you're not taking in as much food. I mean, that's a very
Yeah.
typical thing. Like if you're going to go into sacred space, you fast beforehand and you sort of purify, and so you lessen the body's influence on your consciousness, and you heighten the spiritual influence on the consciousness, and so yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I really appreciate your answer. Yeah, and it made me think of this idea of like that you said, like, basically your answer was like in the beginning of the path you might need the support of the positive view of the positive view of the body to get you going, but later in the path you might need the severity of like, no, you really need to put that away and focus on the spiritual, right?
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense too in terms of Jungian psychology, because Jung said the first half of life we answer the question, what does the world want of me? So it's about, being a professional and maybe getting married and raising children and doing your work in the world and so forth. But then the second half of of life, he said, was about answering, what does the soul want of me? And so it kind of fits, right? Like early on, yeah, you want to support, you need money and you need to support yourself so that you can set. It's kind of like the whole deal with an ego. You have to have a good, strong ego before you can transcend it.
Or even like the will, right? We need to be in touch with our own personal will before we can just surrender to a higher will, divine
Yeah.
will.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. So there's something I thought was interesting when we get to the definitions of Asclepius. This is another document in the Corpus Hermeticum. Um, it just, the way that you summarize these things, it just really stands out to me. So there's God, cosmos, and man, right? There's this three-part nature of the universe, and then within man, or human, if you will, there is soul, spirit, and matter. So you have the above and the below there, which is very hermetic and
Yeah.
very cool. But I was wondering, do you see what those three that they're talking about, soul, spirit, and matter? Is that the tria prima to you?
Soul, spirit, and matter.
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean by the tria prima?
Well, the tria prima are the three primes that, well, see, a lot of people say there was just spirit and sulfur early on in alchemy, and then Paracelsus introduced salt much later. But to
Mm-hmm.
me, I mean, I see them talking about soul, spirit, and matter, and there's the tria
Yeah.
prima, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's always been there, but yeah, it was technically Paracelsus that added salt as the third principle in
Right,
alchemical terms, but
right.
that trinity has been there from the beginning.
Yeah, he didn't actually add anything. He just brought it out. So
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
cool. Yeah, yeah. I was like, wow. I mean, that was really something nice to see. Um, in Asclepius, the perfect sermon, where they're talking about the ensouled statues and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really intense, to think that they had these talking statues that even prophesied, you know. I mean, it was I admittedly, even though I wanted it, I've always been in search of magic. Like, that's how I became an astrologer. I set out looking for magic. I was like, I can't live in a world bereft of magic, man. I can't do it,
Yeah.
and so, but even so, growing up in such a materialist world, it was a stretch for me at times. Like, when I would create a talisman or something, I would be like, did that really work? Like, is it, you're just sort of, you're wondering, like, and and I have seen enough times now to know, oh hell yes, that worked, you know.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to know that, like, oh, I did a magical working and 2 days later I got a bunch of work, right? I mean, that's really cool, but that's one thing. And talking statues is, you know what I'm saying?
I know.
Um,
And I wonder how literally they meant that,
yeah,
because I had the great privilege of going to Egypt last year. And speaking of Sekhmet, I got to go to where the Sekhmet statue is in
nice.
Luxor. And it's one of the only statues that's in place that was left where they found it. Most of them
Mm,
got shipped off to museums.
right.
And in this dark, super hot little room, and you can
Mm,
barely see her because it's so dark in there. But
wow.
the power of that statue, it felt like a living being.
Mm,
You could
wow.
really sense the presence within the stone. And I stood there with her for a very long time. And I can't tell you what the transmission was, but there was definitely a transmission. So
Yeah. And
to
sometimes
me, I
it's
wonder
not
if that's
words, right? It's beyond words.
right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I found that when I get transmissions like that, it could be years later before I finally get it consciously what the hell came
Oh,
through.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
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 Especially the wordless ones. Like, it's wordless, right? So it takes a while
Mm-hmm.
to integrate to where you can have words for it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it reminds me of a kind of a funny story. When I was in college, my roommate had a picture of John Lennon and above his bed, because when you're in college, you have
Oh,
pictures,
yeah. I
whatever.
definitely did.
Mine was Jim Morrison. He was John Lennon. And but this picture, the way his glasses, the light hit them, I swear this thing, it felt like it was watching you wherever you were in the room, right? And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, like that feeling of like, oh, and so yeah, it, like, you could understand that idea of a talking statue in a more subtle form like that, like, oh, it speaks to me as in my consciousness interacts with it, and internally I receive some kind of, communications. And
Yeah.
that may be, closer to the truth of what it was. But the other thing is, I have learned, like, sometimes it's just freaking literal.
Maybe. Maybe. I definitely am not discounting that possibility.
And because, the next question I have for you when we get to, within that treatise is something that's famous tract that's known as the Lament of Hermes, right?
Mm,
And Hermes is giving this prophecy that is just horrible. It's
yeah.
the death and destruction of everything beautiful that Egypt. And he says at one point, he says, "Oh, Asclepius, do you weep? I haven't begun to tell you the depths of this." And I saw, it's really interesting because my question is, do you think we're living in that world?
Part of me does think that, and
Yeah.
I really had a sense of that while I was in Egypt and
Mm.
walking through the temples and seeing so many of the edifices of these beautiful reliefs just defaced,
Yeah.
by people over the centuries, particularly, I think, Egyptians that had converted to Christianity that wanted to make sure the old gods couldn't punish them. So they just went meticulously and just
Mm.
chipped away at every single god
Mm.
on these reliefs. And that just broke my heart to see, and
Yeah.
then you get to see some places where they're intact, where they weren't chipped away, and the beauty of them and the perfection is just so mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really thinking about that lament while I was there and the downfall of
I
Egypt.
bet.
Not,
Yeah.
not to say that, anything bad about Egypt. It's a wonderful country as it is now, and the people are
Sure.
wonderful, but um, there definitely seems to have been something lost.
And really, I was thinking more in terms of psychological and spiritual sense, like we seem lost, and
Yeah. Yeah.
unable to integrate polarities, for instance, like
Mhm.
politically. Like, there's just
Oh,
these
yeah.
really big divisions of, like, these extreme polarities. And it's like the fact that we can't find a middle
Yeah.
speaks to some kind of dis-ease that is sort of anti-hermetic, essentially,
Yeah. Yeah.
And
The
so,
otherizing that we're
mhm,
constantly doing with different political parties and
it's
people.
insane, and it's really painful, actually.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah.
The conversation I've been having with folks lately is how it seems like we're in a collective Nigredo phase, like this
Yes.
phase of alchemy, that
Mhm.
sort of sense of separation and alienation and inability to feel that cohesiveness between two sides within
Mhm.
ourselves. But as a collective, we're kind of going through that.
Yes,
And,
I agree.
it's a necessary breaking down of these sort of systemic structures that are not working anymore,
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's
yeah,
a good point.
patriarchal structures.
It's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah, the Negretto is so necessary. And it's actually, when you speak about the prima materia as this sort of primal darkness, this thrice darkness, that was really good reminder for me, because it's like that is the Negretto, right? Like, that's the
Mhm.
original darkness from which everything comes. Um, and so I definitely want to revisit that. Since we're just going in order, I want to maybe keep going with um, the structure of the book. I really love the way you structure the next part. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 cover the roots, the trunk, and the branches of the tree, and that's just great. I love
Mhm.
it because it's three and it's a living organism, and so of course the roots are in Egypt. The roots, alchemy, the land of the black soil, the land of,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, and the trunk being in the Hellenistic Roman times, when a lot of the I mean, first you had the technical Hermetica came first, actually, and then later the philosophical Hermetica, which is
Yeah.
interesting because I think it's the same with the Chaldean oracles, isn't it? The technical stuff comes first and then the philosophical.
I'm not sure about the Chaldean, but that may be
Okay.
true. Yeah.
I think I remember you saying that. Yeah. And then the three branches, and this has been a big part of what I've been trying to, because I can't tell you how incredibly my mind was blown when, because I had been an astrologer for like, I don't know, 10 or years or more at some point, and I realized, dude, you've only been doing 1/3 of this thing that you're part of, right? There's three arts, there's three Hermetic arts, there's three parts of the wisdom to the whole universe, there's three branches to the Hermetic tree, right? There's the
Mm-hmm.
operation of the stars, yes, astrology.
Mm-hmm.
There's the operation of the moon, which is theurgy, magic,
Mm-hmm.
theurgy and thaumaturgy, if you will. And there's operation of the sun, which is alchemy. And these are they're three related things. And you really, at this point in time, I don't really think you can do one without doing the others, even if you're sort of unconsciously.
Yeah, I think you can do them at varying levels of intensity, Like if
Right.
you're practicing alchemy, might not be doing astrological readings and, predictions and stuff like that. You may just be working on a very basic level of planetary energies and
Right.
days
But
of
if you're
week.
working with 10, you're working with Jupiter.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 The
Yeah.
thunder
There's so
just
much
got, I
overlap.
just got a thunder thing right as I said Jupiter's
No
name.
way.
Yeah, yeah, it's raining here. It's awesome. I love it.
That's
Hail,
great.
hail, God of thunder. Yeah.
Welcome, Jupiter.
So, um, yeah, and the next thing that I thought was really interesting when we get into the operation of the stars, the section that you have on astrology, one thing that you mentioned is the kind of primacy that the deacons had in the
Yeah.
Hermetic, which is explicit. It's explicit even in the technical Hermetica, by the way, which I don't know if you've read all of those. Yeah, they have.
Yeah. Some of them. Yeah.
Yep, they have even like this one section where they talk about, the 27th decan from the horoscopos is about career. It's like this sort of not whole sign houses, but sort of whole decan houses and it's like that's where everything began, is with the deacons, and
Mm-hmm.
that's really Egyptian, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
And so, modern astrologers, I tend to see, because for the Greeks, it was kind of an add-on. They kind of said, well, there's this thing, there's these deacons, and we know they were really important to the Egyptians, so we can't leave them out, but we don't know what to do with them. So we kind of stick them. It's kind of true, actually.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just because that's what the Greeks did with them doesn't mean they're like this, and they're considered like a minor form of dignity. But as far as I can tell, these are not minor at all. In fact,
Yeah.
um, the way that you describe it is that the decans are between the circle of the universe, which I can only guess is like the outermost circle, the celestial sphere,
Mm-hmm.
and the circle of the zodiac. Right, so they're higher in
Right.
the spheres than the zodiac, and in fact, they are the watchers over the zodiac and the seven planets.
Yeah.
And so this is. Did you ever see the or read the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
Long time ago.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that yesterday, though.
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
weird. That's
Yeah.
cool. I love it. There's this one part where Edward, the one brother, he has betrayed his siblings, and he's sort of the Judas of the drama, and the witch, the evil witch, thinks that she has him. She's reveling in her sort of evil plan of, like, breaking up the family and destruction. Yeah. And Aslan says to her, yes, you are correct that, by the current system, you have a right to his soul or whatever it is. But he says, remember, there's a deep magic. And according to the deep magic, if another gives their life in place, then that is broken. And so that's what the deacons remind me of, is like this deep magic, this primal, this primordial, more original, closer to source. Yeah, big time. It feels like, yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually been a focus of mine this year. I decided to do what people call a deck walk.
Yeah.
So starting with Aries, I've been going through each of the decans and just doing a bunch of research, feeling into it, and then writing a post about each one.
Excellent.
And that's on my Patreon blog if people want to tune into that. But yeah, it's been a really fascinating journey. And I totally agree that the Hermetic importance laid on the decans is something that I need to understand, and so that's part of the intention behind this.
Right on.
The way I'm starting to think of them is more like spirits or gods of time itself.
Oh, wow.
And so that's why they're outside of the zodiac, because that all changes with the fluctuation of the constellations and all of that. But these are more like eternal.
Kairos, sacred time.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
And, the way that they've been depicted and described, and the different planets associated with them, depending on the tradition, all of that is relevant, It's like a human being, like they are that person at each stage of their life. They're still the same person, even though they're changing. And so the decans are kind of like that.
They grew up.
Yeah. So
that's really cool. I like that. Yeah, it's still me. I'm still me.
Yeah. And if we think about reality being one unified existence, one unified consciousness that's continually evolving and learning about itself, like why wouldn't the decans be changing over time?
The same way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. My connection with them has mainly been through the Golden Dawn system of correlating them with the minor arcana, which, because my first source into esotericism was the tarot, and the major arcana are super powerful, but the minor arcana are so useful. And they're very specific, and this idea that, these planets that rule the decans, when they're in their home decan, they are sort of channeling the energy of that minor arcana. That's really powerful stuff. And I it's like, I'm sort of ashamed of it, but it's kind of natural. When I first started working with them, I'm like wondering to myself, does this really work? I mean, the Golden Dawn kind of did this thing. Does it work? I think it's sort of natural, and maybe it's even kind of healthy, to sort of, but I worked with the 10 with Mars in the last decan of Pisces, the 10 of Cups.
Yeah.
And I did a working. And that scene in the Rider-Waite Smith version where it's the rainbow in the sky. So while I did this working, I was in search of a property, and the property that I ended up getting, there's this hill, and it's perfectly situated where, like, on a regular basis, I get these things called mountain specters, where there's like this rainbow, or really it's a fog bow. And then when the sun comes through, when the sun finally breaks through, it casts your shadow out into the fog bank, and there's a rainbow around your head.
Isn't that like Herkimer Spectre or something like that?
Brocken Spectre, yeah.
Brocken Spectre, yeah.
Yeah. Brockengespenst in German. Das Brockengespenst.
That's so cool. I just learned about that phenomenon recently, so.
I was aware of it as a photographer, and having submitted my astrophotography for years to various sites, I've seen pictures of it a few times. It's a relatively rare phenomenon as far as I know. and so I had always thought, well, maybe one day if I'm hiking in the mountains of Bolivia, I'll be blessed to see such a thing. You know, I just thought it was like this. And I was standing up there on my hill one day. I saw the sun was coming through the fog, and I just thought, I just want to be up there and witness this. And
Yeah.
I saw this fog bow forming, and instantly I just knew, I don't know why I knew, but I knew that there was something of a 22-degree halo forming, which is you might see a halo around the moon or the sun. That's called a 22-degree. And I just instinctively knew, I was like, there's going to be one of those specters. And I ran and got my camera. Anyway, long story short, I ended up with a rainbow above my house, literally like the scene in that card. I mean,
Amazing.
yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's amazing every time, And so yeah, these decans are really powerful. And I feel like
Yeah.
they are kind of like that deep magic that Aslan talks about,
Well, I listened to your Venus retrograde
Oh,
Alchemy podcast just
wonderful.
yesterday.
Oh, I'm
Because
touched.
I was like, oh, I should listen to his podcast real quick and get in touch with, just kind of connect with
Oh,
the
that's
people
sweet.
before we
Thank
talk.
you.
And I
Yeah.
just was blown away. Really loved the alchemical correlation with the Venus cycle. And,
Right.
instead of the pre-shadow, it's the nigredo, and then the albedo as she goes through the underworld, and
Right.
rubedo on the way out. I thought that was really
Get
beautiful.
some colors in your shadow, people. Come on.
Yeah. And so I also just wrote about the first decan of Leo, which is ruled by Saturn.
Uh-huh.
And one of the gods or spirits connected with it is actually Hephaestus or Vulcan,
Ah, yes,
god
Vulcan.
of fire and metalsmithing
Mm,
and the
yes.
forge. And
Mhm.
so I wrote about that quite a bit.
Who was
And
lame? There's the connection with Saturn.
exactly,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting that you talked about the myth of Coronis. And I was like, oh, I should read that, and I did, and found there's a connection with Hephaestus in that myth through his son Erichthonius, who is part of the reason why the crow sort of gets degraded by Athena, and the owl
Ah,
becomes her main avian
okay.
consort,
Interesting.
But yeah. So
So
anyway,
rich.
I was
Yeah.
just having a lot of like aha moments and kind of
That's
that
awesome.
albedo experience of dissolution where everything is kind of connecting and all the symbols are making sense. And
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Yeah. Well, I had lots of ahas, so that it's great that it's a two-way exchange. I feel,
yeah,
yeah,
appreciate
yeah, I feel very honored by that. Let's see. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about when we get there's the circle of the decans, there's
that.
the circle of the zodiac, which
Hmm.
is the 12 signs, and then there's the 7 spheres of the planets, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it talks about how the 7 bring sort of confusion and turmoil because those daimons act upon the irrational parts of the human nature. Um, and one thing that occurred to me about that, so Plato talks about the circle of the same and the circle of the other, right? And he talks about circle of the same being about that all the planets, stars, and they all rise, culminate, and set on the once per day, right? So that's the circle of the same. And then the circle of the other is really the circle of the 7 because there's 7 different planets. And
Hmm.
one interesting thing I've noticed in astrology, we have this thing called essential dignity. So when a planet is in one of its rulerships, it's said to be more at home and therefore more able to be like itself. And this is a good thing. Most people, oh, I want that in my chart, so on.
Hmm.
But what I noticed very early on, people that had several planets in their dignities, I would think, oh wow, this is lots of good things. So this is good. They were often very confused.
Hmm.
And I thought, and that I at the time I didn't know what to make of it, but later on I realized like it's hard serving more than one master. It's
Ah,
confusing serving more than one master. It's maddening even, you know. And so these people that have just one planet in it, they're like really focused. They don't have this distraction and this confusion. And so it makes me think that it's not so much that in other words, like we have this thing in astrology where the sun is called a functional malefic. That is, it's not its intention or nature to harm you, but if you stay out under the sun long enough, it'll dry your ass out, right? So functionally, it's malefic. It's kind of the same way, like with the seven, it's not necessarily their nature to harm, although some people see them as slave masters and all that. But the fact that there's seven of them means there's seven different wills acting on you. And when you can't serve seven masters, who can? And yet that's the trick, isn't it? to harmonize all of them, to go through all of them, right?
Yeah.
Does that make any sense, what I'm saying?
It does, yeah. And that's a super interesting observation. Makes me want to look at my chart and just like take a tally of everything in its dignity.
Yeah, and the ones that are in the opposite signs of their dignity, to me, what I came up with is, okay, if a planet's in the opposite sign of its dignity, it's kind of telling me, hey, like, don't focus on me so much because I'm sort of in a place where I'm not really able to be myself. And the ones that are is like, they're more of, so it's kind of like, on your stereo, you turn the bass up and you turn the treble down or whatever. It's kind of like a mixing board of the soul is what I thought of it.
Yeah.
And then in the next part you say, so the sun, and specifically it's related to a crown. Like the sun is the crown that has the power to unify the seven, right? And this is in the Hermetica, and because the sun acts on the rational part of the soul. So here we have again that separation between the irrational and the rational, the below and the above, the body and the mind, if you will. But it's really telling to me, and this seems to me, of course, very Egyptian, because the Egyptians were sun worshippers par excellence. I mean, how many different ways did they worship the sun? My favorite is Atum, the one that rose out of the Nile silt, But then you also note that Valens, now a lot of people who are listening to this will know who Valens is, because Valens has been a popular one with the transmissions of the translations since the 90s. A lot of people know about Valens because he's been translated, in the 90s. And Valens rejects this idea that the sun can and so, well, I skipped a part. So if the sun unifies the seven and acts on the rational part, then we can maybe escape or rise above the fate that is deterministically imposed on us by the seven daimons, right? So there's these, that's why some people see them as jailers, because they're sort of imposing their will on us, essentially. But the sun has the power to free us from that in this one view, Hermetic view. Valens says, no, very Stoic, actually, which is very Greek, and very Hellenistic Greek in particular. No, this is just a matter of mapping out your fate, and the sooner you get around to accepting it, the better you'll feel, and so on. Like really classic Stoic take. And it really sort of gives me that contrast, because a lot of people think that Stoicism is the primary influence. And in fact, I just had this conversation with Bruce Schofield, who's an astrologer that I interviewed about his latest book recently. And I said, I think a lot of people are under the impression that Stoicism is the main influence on early Hellenistic astrology, but Hermeticism cannot be discounted, I don't think, because it's there from the beginning. For instance, one of the things that they do is they take the malefics, Mars and Saturn, and they say, okay, the problem with Mars is that he's too hot. He's always, tearing things up. And so we'll put him with the nocturnal sect. We'll put him with the ladies, Venus and the moon, and it'll chill him out and things will be better. That's very much like what we were talking about, escaping the fate of, like, that's magical thinking, basically.
Mhm.
That's not Stoicism. You're not just accepting Mars the way he is. You're
Right.
trying to balance that stuff. You're trying to really, it's heros it's sacred opposites being, we're going to
Yeah.
stick the bad boy with the ladies, and that
Yeah.
has its own issues, but
Well, I think the Stoicism comes in because we do need to acknowledge these influences on our life and these maybe
oh yeah.
limitations or structures that are kind of influencing us
Mm.
unconsciously or irrationally. And that, you know, I see that as part of that first phase of alchemy where you kind of just get real with yourself and like, okay, this is
I've
who
got
I
a
am. This
problem.
is what I've got to work with.
We have a problem,
And
Houston.
yeah, exactly. But then there's this sort of empowered sense of like, okay, I can actually transform this. I can transmute this alchemically. I can evolve.
Wonderful. I love that. Yeah, the Stoicism is the acceptance of things as they are. And then you can kind of kick into your Hermetic sense of like, okay, there's wiggle room and let's get wiggling.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in psychological terms, when we're working with the shadow, first we have to acknowledge it. We have to be able to see it and bring
Right,
it to light, and
right.
there's that acceptance, like, okay, this is a part of me. It's ugly. I don't want it to be a part of me, but here it is. And I'm going to look at it and I'm going to maybe love it.
Yeah,
And in
beautiful.
that process, then the transmutation starts to happen and it can become an ally that's actually working for us rather than
That's
against us.
great. What did you think about what I said, by the way, about the love being the philosopher's stone? What do you think? Maybe?
Oh, yes. Yes. I
I
love
mean,
that.
it's at least
Yeah.
part of it. It's
Yeah.
maybe it's the ether that gets you to the, but yeah, it seemed
Yeah.
appropriate talking about Venus.
Yeah. I think Alejandro Jodorowsky said the same thing.
Oh yeah? Oh,
Yeah.
cool. Oh, I'm in good company then. Um, so moving on to the operation of the moon, which is theurgy, thaumaturgy, magic. Um, You mentioned the moon as the unconscious mind, and you say that magic is essentially mind control. Learning to control your mind is how we achieve magic. And Thoth was, of course, was a lunar god, actually,
Mhm.
and so naturally the god of magic. And it made me, sometimes I can be a little bit contrarian, so I'm not trying to contradict you necessarily, but I'm trying to see like maybe the natural opposite to that or something. I
Mhm.
wonder if it isn't also actually unleashing the mind, as in
Mhm.
like sort of unleashing the golden shadow, maybe, or in other words, like sometimes our mind, we get stuck in a very limited view in our mind of things. And actually, when we allow the unconscious to come in, there's a much more complete view of things, and it's actually liberating
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
where we get the whole picture and so many more possibilities are available to us. Does that make any sense?
It does. And I don't see that as contradicting at all because I think it takes a certain measure of control to be able to unleash the mind
Right. Without,
in a way
you
that
know,
doesn't tear you apart completely.
yes. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I agree completely. That's very much a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I could say a lot more about that, but there's a lot more other stuff that I want to talk about. So, um, let's see. I think this distinction that you make between theurgy and taumaturgy is really important because right now, astro magic is very popular. And I got into it before it became a thing. Now it's a thing. So I feel I'm an accidental hipster, but at any rate, that's only like, that's more like what we call thaumaturgy, right? Like creating talismans or those statues that we're talking statues. That's more like bringing the magical energy down into an embodied form. That's more like thaumaturgy. Um, Theurgy is actually about the process of raising our spiritual being, or maybe even establishing our spiritual being on these 7 planes of 7 daimons. And that's the Hermetic journey of that. If you can raise yourself above the planes of the 7 planets, then you can experience oneness with God and gnosis of God. And that's sort of the liberation from this sort of place of being. And you know, for people like Zosimos, right, that was actually like, he was like, yeah, that's actually where it's at. Like, this other thing is kind of like lowbrow almost, it seemed like, to Zosimos. He was more interested in the theurgy, don't you think?
Yeah, I guess you could see it that way. I think I quote him a couple times in that section as
Yeah,
sort of deprecating magic and
right.
saying, no, just, well, actually, I think he would be more in line with surrendering your will to the divine will, you know, and allowing the miracles to work through you in that way by connecting with the source, with God.
Uh-huh.
And that, like, exerting your will through magic is not necessary, or like something we shouldn't really be trying to do.
Superfluous, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that would be more of Zosimos's take on
Okay.
that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. And yeah, and so, you know, because I feel like there's a lot of people that follow me who feel sort of compelled to get into talismanic work or whatever, because like that's, everybody's doing it, and it's like there's really another school of thought that says you don't got to do that. So if you're if you're not drawn specifically to it, it's okay. Like, there's another level that's really just about consciousness raising, essentially, and oneness with God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think really the essence of this path is connecting with these divinities, right? And understanding how we relate to them, how they're working through us, forming a personal relationship with them, and allowing that to be sort of a guiding mechanism, light in our lives, you know?
Yeah.
That's really the essence of it. And then there's so many different ways that you can get really technical about it. And
Oh my God, yes.
yeah.
Yeah, and being a Virgo moon, I mean, I love the technical, so of course
Yeah.
I'm, you know, doing that part, but yeah, no, you really don't have to go that route. If you just want to be a mystic, that's totally welcome. And Zosimos would be an encourager of that path for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, if you read the Corpus Hermeticum and those traditional Hermetic texts, like the theological ones, it's very much a mystical
Oh,
approach,
yes.
you know,
Yeah, absolutely.
meditative, contemplative, mystical approach, maybe with some meditation and visioning experiences, but like
Yes.
the actual technical stuff is not really part of those.
No, you're absolutely. In fact, it's so much so that, being a pretty practical person myself, I had a very hard time with the Hermetica at first. And in fact, I got the most out of reading people talking about the Hermetica than reading it itself. It took me reading other people talking about it for a while before I could really approach the material itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's very mystical.
Yeah.
There's a place on page 68 where we're talking about practical magic, and you're talking about the Picatrix. And you're talking about that practical magic is the union of the 3 natures, and I assume you're talking about the Tria Prima there, the 3 natures, with the stars. And I went back and looked at the Picatrix. I mean, you're not directly quoting, but it's a very accurate paraphrase. They talk about the use of suffumigation to provide natural heat for digestion. Now, I should probably give a little bit of background for the listeners. Digestion in alchemy is like, for instance, alchemists would put some herbs in a flask in water, and then they would put it in a pit and like line the pit with manure or something to provide a gentle heat, which would digest. The herb would be digested. It would slowly, its essence would be brought out of the plant material and sort of pervade the liquid, right? Is that a fairly
Oh, yeah,
accurate?
that's great.
Okay. So what I'm wondering is, how does that apply to talisman making? Like, it makes me think that, obviously when you're suffumicating, so there's a heat involved. And I always thought the purpose of the suffumigation was that you could help visualize your prayers going up to heaven, right? But the idea that it's providing heat for digestion makes me think that actually when you ensoul the talisman, that it's a being and that it grows and has its own life. And there's this process of digestion whereby whatever you started gradually becomes integrated into maybe not even just the talisman itself, but into the maker's consciousness and or the wearer's consciousness. Like there's this process of digestion that happens sort of after.
Yeah,
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's a really perceptive observation of you. I think of digestion also similar to gestation, so you need that steady, low, consistent heat, which the manure provides. And it's similar when there's a
or a
fetus gestating
bird
in the
sitting
womb,
on its eggs
or a
is a
bird on its
common
eggs.
metaphor that they make. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. And so with the talisman or something that you're ensouling in that way with the fumigation and the invocations and calling the spirit into it, it makes sense that there would need to be a digestive period for it to take effect, for that to be birthed. And it makes me think about the process of manifestation in general, where we sort of inseminate the unconscious realm of potentiality with our conscious desire. And so then there's a period of gestation or digestion. We don't know how long that is before that's going to come into form and express itself in our reality.
Yeah. Did this work? Is she pregnant?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did it take? Yeah.
We'll find out.
That's really cool. And so moving on to the operation of the sun, and I want to say briefly, like, this is just my own thing, but if I were going to bring somebody into these Hermetic arts at this point, I would probably bring them in through the operation of the sun first. Alchemy, that is, because it's basically a purification process. You mentioned the Negretto and that need to just get real, and the need to actually unlearn some crap that's going to get in the way of the albedo, the good stuff that you want to come in.
Right.
So let's see. I guess, there's a lot we could say about that. I really love how you went through like the whole timeline of the Persian Golden Age and how that got transmitted into 12th century Europe, and then Paracelsus gets a hold of it, and then there's the Rosarium Philosophorum, which, that idea of the hieros, right? And I did a talk in England one time where I was just telling a bunch of astrologers, like, look in the alchemy literature, like how many pictures there are of the sun and the moon, and when they come together, there's Mercury, like there's this. And people were just like blown away. They were like, wow, like an image really does speak 1,000 words. And this, and bringing that idea back into our astrology, there's so many ways. We could talk about like literally the sun and the moon, like the syzygies, what they're called, like new moon and full moon. We could talk about Venus and Mars. Like there's a lot of stuff that we can do with that as astrologers. And so just like sort of waking people up to that alchemical concept. And of course, from there, the Rosicrucians get a hold of it, and then the Golden Dawn, and people like Jung and Iliade. And so I just think it's great that you cover all that. And one of the things that I think is really cool that you note is like that things like agriculture, pottery, metallurgy, architecture, these are alchemy. These are Hermetic arts as well. specifically like with agriculture. I mean, the black land, I mean, it wasn't just the black land because of each year the Nile, the silt would be deposited, right? So there was this fertile, but the act of agriculture is the act of like imposing order on nature, number one, but it's also the act of understanding the cyclic nature and understanding like when your crop is done, you have to compost that and break it down and turn it into shit.
Yeah.
Literally, right? And so there's a very, I mean, I think of agriculture as like the first alchemy, really, even before metallurgy, although technically metallurgy kind of came first. We were wielding axes and stuff. So, you could argue about that, but agriculture to me seems like a more full-blown alchemy in that it is really sort of like this, you can see the zodiac as sort of an agricultural calendar, and it's sort of like this literally alchemical way of life even. And I don't know if people really, we're so far removed from our agricultural, and a lot of people are, from our agricultural practices, that if they make that connection. But I think it was really great of you to mention that. I'm a gardener, so I'm doing that stuff every day.
Oh yeah.
Making compost as we speak. And it's like, there's a saying that I always tell people, somebody was on Twitter, today complaining about that it's the X thing. And it's like, there was a lament, going on about, I literally, rest in peace, Twitter, this has gone to shit. It's like, well, actually, that's kind of a good thing. Like, it means you're in the degredo, which means transformation, which means rebirth is on the way, right? And so that was sort of the point of the podcast that I did last time, understanding that Negredo is purposeful. It's not nihilism at all. It's actually the first step. And it brings me back to part 2, where you talk about the cosmogony in the book, and I think this is really brilliant the way you do this as well, because I think, understanding the Hermetic cosmogony is really important, because essentially what we're doing is we're recapitulating the creation of the world each time that we create a work of art, a piece of pottery. My garden for this year is a specific, creation. Each time we're recapitulating the original creation in sort of microcosm, right? And so the better we understand the original creation, the Hermetic cosmogony, it's a map for how to create, right? And so I love that you just start like right at the beginning, which is matter, right? The prima materia. This thrice, how is it? Thrice unknown darkness, right?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. Like, as a woman, thrice unknown darkness, what does that mean to you? How do you connect with that?
Well, so many of our early cosmogonies talk about things beginning in darkness, right? Like a dark primordial sea, an infinite abyss, chaos.
All of them, in fact.
Everything exists within that. It's just pure potentiality, but none of it is defined, And the way I think about that is like a womb, and we all have this within us, male or female, this realm of pure potentiality and unknown, and
maybe we just the unconscious.
The unconscious. Yeah. And when we're creating, that's where we're venturing into through the imagination.
Yeah.
And allowing ourselves to break that open, and order then can come to these elements that are in a state of undifferentiated chaos. Basically, we bring order to that, we bring form to that. And so we are, like you said, recapitulating that initial creation every time we engage with the creative act,
right?
And truly all of the time, because the original creator, it was a thought that
Logos.
created,
Yes.
logos, everything, the second mind, that reflection of that initial unity that created duality in the way that we experience reality in this dual way.
Mm-hmm.
We're all doing that constantly with our thoughts,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the more we can kind of get in touch with the unconscious daimonic influences that are affecting our thoughts, and these different ways that we've been conditioned by family and culture, the more self-actualized we can become, and more self-directed or connected with something deeper and more profound and divine within ourselves. It's the guiding principle.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think also of there's a young man that I'm sort of mentoring a little bit in the magical work, and he said to me, he said, sometimes I think I'm going a little bit crazy. And I said to him, no, brah, you're going sane. And what I meant by that was, yes, you are going a little bit crazy, but you have to go a little bit crazy, right? The original state was this undifferentiated chaos. So unless you're feeling a little bit negretto, blackening, darkening, and a little bit crazy, a little bit being the key, right? Because like you said, it is still controlled chaos. You can't just, right, just, go completely crazy because you don't come back.
Well, yeah, if you do, it's quite remarkable. But
Yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, that idea of like, that, these things that, typically we see as symptoms, right? Like if you're feeling a little depressed, or if you're feeling a little manic, or if you're feeling a little confused and scattered,
Yeah.
ADHD, all of these things that we think, take a pill for that. Maybe not. Maybe you're actually like reaching a very creative place that is the original place,
Yeah.
yeah. It's
I think
sorry,
that's one of the big lessons that comes from alchemy in this Negredo stage, is like being curious about that rather than pathologizing it and getting
right.
stuck there and identifying with it. Like, I have this, I have depression, I have ADHD,
right.
and I think there's a place for that. And there's sometimes medication is necessary.
Sure.
I'm not saying that
Of
people
course.
should go off medication or
No,
anything.
Neither am
There's
I, to be
also
clear.
just another way of understanding it as a process, as a necessary process, and as a communication from the body that there's something that wants to be seen, acknowledged, explored, opened, so that we can be more fully integrated with full scope of who we are.
Right. And that's the thing. It's an invitation it's the heroine's journey, right? I mean, that's each time it's like, I think of it like the Orphic egg, where the universe is contained in an egg, and then, the chick hatches and it comes, and then guess what? It's just inside of another egg and you're just constantly hatching out of this egg into more of yourself. It's like the reverse of this idea of pulling back the layers of the onion. Yeah, I think of it that way. So chaos precedes creation. There's sort of, but there's this unity, right? This original undifferentiated unity, and then so there's one, right? There's this one thing, and so there's this kind of Pythagorean concept that like the process of creation can actually simply be followed through the numerical sequence, right? There was one, and out of one comes polarity, comes two, right?
Yeah.
And this idea of polarity is very, very essential to alchemy, to hermetics, right? For that matter, gender is, although that's a very complicated topic and we need not, go down that road. But from these polarities, we kind of have this idea of again, sun, moon, Mercury, right? So father, mother, child, right? There's this divine child that is born from the union of these polarities. And
Yeah.
so from the 2 comes the 3, right? And so the
Right.
three are the tria prima, right? Soul, spirit, and salt. Consciousness, that is consciousness itself, not our consciousness, like that we identify with, personality more or less, which is not really our consciousness actually, but like consciousness itself, and then mind, which is something different than consciousness itself. Mind is sort of a particularized form of consciousness, and then body. So
Yeah.
there's also almost like 3 levels of being, if you want to think of them that way, with sort of body being the densest. And so in that, going back to what we were saying about with Paracelsus, it kind of makes sense that salt was the final of the 3, right?
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
yeah. And then, of course, from the 3 comes the 4. We have the 4 elements. And then when we combine 3 and 4, what do we get? We get the heptad. We get the 7.
7. Yeah.
Right. And so this part that you go through in the book, I mean, I just think that's really like beautiful, because I don't know that too many people, like we said in the beginning, like I don't even know if a whole lot of astrologers understand their hermeticists, or hermetists, whichever. And I don't know that they understand like that these 7 that they're constantly dealing with, like they come from the 1 and the 2 and the 3 and the 4, right? So I really love that you just sort of methodically go through all that. And then with regard to the 7, there's so the one question that I had when I mentioned your book to my audience, one guy rang in and he said he noticed that there's kind of 2 different orders when we talk about the 7 in terms of like the chakras or something. There's kind of 2 different orders, right? There's the Chaldean order, which like on page 124, when you're referencing Dee's celestial egg, and on page 126, when you're talking about Valentine's, journey through the 7 alchemical operations, that goes through the Chaldean order, which for people that don't know, it's in order of the speed of the planets. So there's Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the moon, right?
You're right.
So it's like that's the Chaldean order.
Yeah.
But then on page 127, when you're talking about the chakras, we have the sun at the top with the crown. And so the sun isn't in that 4th place in the center, it's actually at the top. And so so there's these 2 orders, and that's not just in your book, by the way. I should point, like, these 2 orders, they just are. There's just 2 orders. And some people choose one, some people choose the other, but I just wondered if it isn't kind of like that thing where we were talking about before, where there's kind of like the positive view of the body and materiality, and there's the negative view. There's kind of like these 2 orders, and they can be used for different functions.
Yeah, or like the difference you pointed out between the Hermetic conception of the sun versus the like balance perspective of the sun just being one of the 7, right?
Right.
And to me, it's a paradox, and that's okay. It's both. So, and the chakras, that comes from the Indian tradition, the Hindu tradition.
Yeah, and it comes from the zodiac, right? Because you have Leo and Cancer, right? And then you have Aquarius and Capricorn, and the planets fan out in that order, right? So you've got Saturn, right? Saturn rules Aquarius and Capricorn. Jupiter rules the next 2 signs, Sagittarius and Pisces, and then Mars, Aries and Scorpio, Venus, Libra and Taurus, Mercury, Gemini and Virgo, and then the sun. I'm actually going down, but I should be going up. The sun at the top. Right. So it follows the zodiacal order, actually. And and it's also very prevalent in the Jyotish or Hindu tradition. And it makes sense.
In the Hindu tradition of the chakras, often the heart is Venus.
Mm.
right? But then when you look at a lot of like texts on melasthesia and where the zodiac corresponds in the body, where the planets correspond in the body, the sun is placed in the heart. And so
Yeah.
if you're going in the Chaldean order, that makes sense because you start
Yeah.
with Jupiter and the root chakra at the base
You
of the
get here
spine.
as the sun, right? And then Venus,
Yeah.
Mercury, Moon. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't see that as contradictory. I just think that there is an aspect of the sun that lives in the heart, and there's an aspect of the sun that connects us with the source as being
Hmm.
that divine light that, the source emanates through the rays of the sun. And so that's our crown chakra, the thousand petaled lotus opening to cosmic consciousness.
That hermetic sun that allows us to be freed from the sort of warring, trying to serve seven masters,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's cool. I wanted to address it because I think it's a fair question. Most
Oh,
people,
yeah.
when confronted with a paradox, they, especially nowadays, it's like immediately there's a forced choice. You must choose, and it's like, no, really,
Yeah.
it's okay that
Yeah.
there's two.
And I think I do touch on that in the chapter on the sun.
Okay,
Um,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think I
might have
do.
missed that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for pointing that out.
Or maybe it's in the chapter on Venus and the heart chakra, but it's in one of those places.
Right, it would naturally be, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just thought that was interesting because, yeah, I mean, I can, Joseph Campbell talks about like that the heart is the place where that separates our sort of animal nature from our true human nature, and it's love, it's like that's what separates us. That's really what unlocks our higher nature is love. And so there's that idea of love being the philosopher's stone, if you will. But I can also really see and appreciate actually, because a lot of people, they poo-poo the ancient system because, oh, those fools thought that that the sun rotated. But no, actually the sun was already always at the center, you see. Even though it's not heliocentric per se, the sun was still at the center, in fact,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of the seven. So yeah, I can totally appreciate both. And I think both probably have their purpose. I mean, when I think of the sun at the center, like the sun specifically related to the heart chakra, I think of that sort of intelligence of the heart that they speak of, like that is sort of specifically Egyptian. Like the Egyptians thought that your consciousness was in your heart,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's why they weighed the heart at the end of the life to see if you passed muster, against the feather of Mot.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. And then of course, part 3 of the book, as you've just alluded to, is chapters on each of the 7. And they're sort of wonderful guided meditations of just a potpourri or a wonderful feast of different mythical and alchemical and astrological references to just sort of fill you up with the different ideas and philosophies and connections to experience these beings, these spheres on the Kabbalah, these beings, these parts of our soul that we need to fully understand in order to fully be ourselves, right? So that's the third part of the book. And just as a whole, I'm just really, really, really pleased because people always ask me, Gary, what's the one book that I can get that'll just get me Hermetics? Like, what book can I get? They're looking for one book. And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, there is not. Now I got one to send them to, and so that's really great.
That's so great.
Yeah, it really is. Well, geez, I'm out of questions, and I think we're probably pretty close to that time.
Yeah.
Again, people can find you at marlene7bremner.com. You're on Instagram, of course, as an artist. Facebook as well. I think you mentioned earlier about Patreon, that you're doing a Patreon thing. Is that your
Yeah.
You Can Walk?
Yep, the Deck and Walk is on Patreon, and it's just part of my blog on there. So that's available for $1 a month. So if you just want to
Oh
tune
my
in about
goodness.
the Deckins, it'll go straight to your email for just $1 a month.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's got to be the best bargain I've seen in a while.
And there's other tiers where you get different rewards if you subscribe for more, but the
Awesome.
Deckins available at $1. So
And people can find that on your website and stuff.
yeah, there's a link on the website, and my handle on Patreon is just 7art, spelled out, 7art.
7art. Awesome. And of course, this is just, and I want to hold the book up one more time for people to see. Now, if I can get it. Yeah, there we go. This is just, it's a disappearing act. I am really a magician here. This is just the first of 2 that you've done. Your second book is out, and I have it.
Yeah, and here's the second book.
Awesome.
Yeah.
The Hermetic Marriage of Art and Alchemy, which is, I guess that's like where you really get to shine as a Hermetic artist.
Indeed. Yeah, this gets much more into the alchemical aspect of it, and it's sort of instead of a history of Hermeticism, you get more of a history of art and how it relates to the occult and alchemy. And then I take the reader through a journey of the 4 stages of the magnum opus. So
4 colors.
The 4 colors, yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. So the kind of occult creationist aspect of art. Excellent. Really cool stuff. Well, I hope that eventually we can get you back on the show to talk about that one too.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you too. And I don't know, like maybe we could do it on this show, or maybe I would do it, some other way. But another thing that I thought to mention to you is like you have such a grasp of the Hermetic literature. It would be really interesting to just kind of go through each of them, go through the poemandries, and just do a podcast on. Does that make any sense? I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody's done it, but I thought I may just plant that seed out there. I don't know if you'd be up for it, but it might be fun.
That sounds great. I think that'd be really fun for people. I'll
just plant that up there in the well, how did you mention it earlier? We're inseminating consciousness with our intentions, and like if and if it takes, we'll see, something will start kicking me in my gut sooner or later, I guess.
Exactly.
All right. Well, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much once again for a wonderful book and for being such a gracious guest.
Thank you, Gary. It's been lovely talking to you.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, Marlene. See you soon.
All right. Take care.
All right.